Have you ever stood in front of someone and felt something you couldn't explain? As if they were completely here, completely real, while everyone else around you felt distant, mechanical, almost asleep. And have you ever wondered why that presence unsettled you? Why it lingered in your chest long after the moment passed? Most people spend their lives searching for awakening in the wrong places. They look for signs that are loud, dramatic, and visible. They listen for impressive words, follow those who speak with authority, admire those who look spiritual, sound enlightened, or seem to possess something special. And yet, again and again, something feels off. Something doesn't quite ring true. Because genuine awakening does not announce itself. It does not perform. It does not need to be recognized. In fact, the most awakened person in the room is often the one you overlook completely. There is a quiet kind of clarity that doesn't draw attention, a depth that doesn't demand applause, a way of being that doesn't try to convince you of anything, and yet somehow changes the way you see yourself just by standing near it. This is what creates confusion in spiritual spaces. We mistake intensity for truth. We confuse knowledge with wisdom. We assume that those who speak the most must see the most. But awakening is not about sounding profound. It is not about appearing evolved. It is not about collecting insights, experiences, or spiritual identities. It is something far more subtle and far more confronting. When you encounter someone who is truly awake, there is no performance to analyze, no image to admire. Instead, there is a strange sense of ease, a naturalness that feels almost disarming, a presence that does nothing, yet somehow exposes everything. You may notice your own thoughts slowing down, your need to impress fading, your internal noise becoming quieter, not because they're doing anything to you, but because something in their way of being reveals what is usually hidden beneath all the noise. And this is where the discomfort begins. Because once you start to see what genuine awakening actually looks like, you also begin to see how rare it is and how much of what passes for spirituality is something else entirely. You begin to notice the difference between someone who has learned about truth and someone who is living from it. There are signs, clear signs, not mystical, not dramatic, not glamorous, but unmistakable once you know how to recognize them. Signs that have nothing to do with beliefs, techniques, or appearances. Signs that quietly expose the ego, dissolve illusions, and challenge everything we think awakening should look like. And the most unsettling part? Once you truly understand these signs, you may realize that the question was never how to recognize someone who is awake, but why this recognition feels so confronting when it happens. There comes a moment in many people's lives when ordinary explanations begin to feel insufficient. Nothing dramatic has happened on the surface. Life looks normal from the outside, and yet internally, something has shifted. A subtle tension appears, a quiet sense that reality is speaking, but not in a language you were taught to recognize. It often begins in small, almost dismissible ways. You wake from a dream that feels unusually vivid, not symbolic in the usual sense, but present, as if it carried a weight that lingers throughout the day. Not a message you can explain, but a feeling that stays with you, hovering just beneath your thoughts. Or you find yourself pausing for no clear reason, seized by a sudden intuition, an inner knowing that arises without logic, without argument, yet feels strangely accurate. Sometimes it appears in the body, a tightness in the chest when something doesn't feel right, a wave of calm that arrives unexpectedly in the middle of chaos, a sense of unease in places where everything seems fine, or a feeling of peace in situations that should make you anxious. You may try to explain these sensations away, stress, imagination, coincidence, but deep down you know that explanation doesn't quite reach it. And so the confusion begins. Because we live in a world that teaches us to trust what can be measured, named, and proven. We are taught to value noise over silence, certainty over intuition, answers over questions. When something subtle arises, something quiet and inward, we are quick to dismiss it. Or worse, we begin to doubt ourselves. Yet many people quietly share the same experience. They sense that something meaningful is happening beneath the surface of everyday life, that reality has layers, that there is a kind of intelligence moving through moments, relationships, and even discomfort. But without a framework to understand it, this awareness becomes unsettling rather than liberating. Some turn outward, searching for teachers, explanations, labels. Others turn inward, questioning their sanity, wondering why they feel different, why they no longer relate to life in the same way. They notice that conversations feel shallow, routines feel hollow, and achievements no longer satisfy in the way they once did. There is a growing sense of distance, not from life, but from the version of life they were told was all there is. This is where many people get lost. They mistake the language of this inner movement for something extraordinary, something supernatural, something that must be decoded or controlled. Or they assume that it means something is wrong with them, that they are broken, ungrounded, or drifting away from reality. Very few recognize what is actually happening, because this experience is not random, it is not meaningless, and it is not a mistake. It is a form of communication, quiet, subtle, deeply personal, that does not shout to be heard. It waits. It reveals itself only when attention slows down enough to notice it. And most importantly, it does not point outward. It points inward, towards something that has always been present but rarely acknowledged. The discomfort you feel is not the problem. The confusion is not a failure. The sense that something doesn't quite fit anymore is not a loss. It is an invitation. An invitation to see the difference between mental noise and genuine awareness, between imagination and perception, between searching for meaning and recognizing what has been there all along. But this invitation cannot be accepted in the usual way, through effort, belief, or accumulation of knowledge. And this raises a far more unsettling question than most people are willing to ask. What if these moments, these dreams, sensations, intuitions, and quiet disruptions are not trying to give you answers at all, but are slowly preparing you to recognize something you have been overlooking in plain sight? The first great sign is not something you see, it is something that quietly disappears. Most people assume that awakening arrives as an addition, more insight, more clarity, more understanding. They imagine it as an accumulation, a sudden expansion of knowledge that makes life brighter, sharper, more impressive. But the ancient teachings point in the opposite direction. The earliest wisdom traditions, long before modern spirituality gave names and techniques to everything, all hinted at the same paradox. Awakening begins not with gaining, but with losing. Specifically, the loss of inner noise. There comes a moment, sometimes subtle, sometimes unsettling, when the internal commentary begins to loosen its grip. The voice that narrates, judges, compares, and rehearses starts to quiet down, not because you force it into silence, but because something deeper no longer believes every thought it produces. This is the first hidden sign, a natural detachment from compulsive thinking. You may still think, thoughts still arise, but they no longer feel like you. They pass through like clouds rather than chains. And with this shift comes something most people don't expect, a strange sense of ordinariness. Nothing mystical on the surface, no fireworks, just a quiet, grounded clarity that feels more real than anything dramatic ever did. Ancient teachers described this as returning to the uncarved block, a state before identity hardened into roles, stories, and ambitions. Long before spiritual paths became systems to follow, this was understood as the foundation, awareness recognizing itself without commentary. And this is where many people misunderstand the experience. They assume that if awakening were real, it would feel extraordinary. Instead, it often feels simple, almost too simple to trust. You notice yourself listening more deeply, reacting less automatically. Situations that once pulled you into emotional spirals no longer hook you in the same way, not because you are suppressing anything, but because the need to defend a fragile inner identity has softened. This is not emotional numbness, it is emotional clarity. You still feel sadness, joy, frustration, tenderness, but these emotions no longer define you. They move through awareness instead of becoming stories about who you are. And this changes everything about how you relate to life. Consider a simple moment. Someone criticizes you.
In the past, your mind would immediately respond, defending, justifying, replaying the interaction long after it ended. Now, something different happens. You feel the sensation of the words, the emotional ripple, but the story doesn't take over. There is space, and in that space, you see clearly. This clarity is not cold or detached, it is deeply human. The ancient texts warned that this stage would feel unsettling because it removes something people rely on for a sense of control, the belief that they are their thoughts. When this belief dissolves, even slightly, it can feel like standing on unfamiliar ground. Yet beneath that uncertainty is a profound relief, as if a long, exhausting effort has quietly ended. This is why truly awakened individuals rarely appear extraordinary. They are no longer trying to be someone. The inner performance has stopped.
Life is met directly, without the constant filter of interpretation. And to a world addicted to noise, this quiet presence can feel almost invisible or deeply unsettling. This first sign is not taught openly because it threatens the entire economy of self-improvement and spiritual striving. It cannot be packaged or sold. You cannot pretend to have it. You either notice the space or you don't. And once you do, a subtle recognition begins to form. The peace you were searching for was never hidden. It was simply covered by the effort to become something else. If this insight resonates with you, take a moment to support this space. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and become part of this community, quietly gathering those who sense there is more beneath the surface and are willing to look honestly. Because once the noise softens, something far more challenging begins to reveal itself, and the next sign does not arrive as silence, but as a confrontation with how deeply we resist what is. There was a time when I believed awakening would arrive as a breakthrough, something unmistakable, dramatic, and undeniable. I imagined it as a moment that would divide my life into before and after. I was searching constantly, reading, listening, trying to recognize the signs, trying to become someone who had arrived. And the more I searched, the more distant everything felt. Then, something unexpected happened. It wasn't during a meditation. It wasn't during a retreat. It wasn't even during a moment I would have called spiritual. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in a place so familiar it barely registered. The light coming through the window was dull, almost gray. Outside, life moved on with its usual rhythm, cars passing, distant voices, nothing remarkable. I remember feeling tired, not physically, but in a deeper way. Tired of trying to understand myself, tired of explaining my inner life, tired of carrying the invisible weight of needing to figure things out. And in that exhaustion, something softened. I wasn't trying to observe my thoughts. I wasn't trying to be present. I simply stopped resisting the moment. The frustration, the confusion, the sense of not knowing what I was supposed to do with my life, all of it was allowed to be there without commentary. No fixing, no spiritual interpretation, just honesty. And that's when I noticed it. The mind kept producing thoughts, just as it always had, but for the first time, I wasn't standing inside them. I was aware of them from a distance that felt intimate and spacious at the same time. It was subtle, almost to miss, yet unmistakable. Like realizing you've been clenching your jaw all day and suddenly letting go. There was no surge of joy, no vision, no feeling of being special. What replaced the noise was something quieter and far more real. I noticed the texture of the air, the weight of my body in the chair, the simple fact of being here, breathing, without needing to label it. And with that came a strange sense of relief, followed by something else entirely, a vulnerability I hadn't expected. Because without the inner commentary, there was nowhere to hide. Memories surfaced, regrets, old fears, patterns I had spent years justifying. But instead of collapsing under them, I found myself meeting them with an unfamiliar gentleness. Not acceptance as an idea, but acceptance as an experience. They were seen, felt,
and allowed to pass without becoming a story about who I was. In the days that followed, life didn't change on the outside. I still woke up tired, still had responsibilities, still felt emotions rise and fall, but something fundamental had shifted in how those experiences were held. The urgency to define myself, to explain who I was becoming or where I was going, began to loosen. I noticed it most clearly in my interactions with others. Conversations slowed down. I listened more than I spoke, not because I was trying to be mindful, but because there was no longer the same pressure to perform. Silence stopped feeling awkward. In difficult moments, instead of reacting immediately, there was space, just enough to respond from clarity rather than habit. And that's when I realized something unsettling. Everything I had been searching through effort was already present when effort stopped. This experience didn't make me wiser in the way I once imagined. It made me simpler, more ordinary, more honest. And that ordinariness was the most confronting part of all, because there was no identity to cling to, no spiritual role to inhabit, just this, life exactly as it is, moving freely when resistance loosens. I've heard variations of this story from many people since then, different details, different circumstances, but the same core recognition. It often arrives through exhaustion, loss, or deep frustration, not as a reward, but as a release. And it leaves behind a question that lingers quietly in the background of everything else. If this shift didn't come from effort, knowledge, or technique, what has actually been guiding these moments of recognition all along? If you've ever experienced something like this, however small or difficult to explain, I invite you to share it. Leave a comment describing a moment, a feeling, or a sign that stayed with you longer than it should have. I read these experiences carefully, and some of them may be spoken aloud in future reflections. Because hidden within these personal stories is a deeper pattern, one that reveals a second sign far more challenging than the first. A sign that tests how we meet life when it refuses to match our expectations. The second great sign is far more confronting than the first, because it doesn't arrive as silence. It arrives as life itself, refusing to cooperate with your expectations. Once the inner noise begins to loosen, something unexpected happens. You don't float above life, you don't escape difficulty. Instead, life starts meeting you more directly. Situations arise that test your patience, your plans, your identity. And this is where most people become confused again, assuming that something has gone wrong. But this is not a setback. This is the sign. The second hidden signal of genuine awakening is a radical shift in how resistance shows up, or rather, how it dissolves. Before this shift, life feels like a negotiation. You constantly measure moments against how they should be. You resist discomfort, argue with reality, replay events in your mind wishing they had unfolded differently. Even spiritual growth becomes another battlefield, another way of trying to control outcomes. But as awakening deepens, something subtle yet unmistakable begins to occur. Resistance loses its grip. This does not mean you become passive or indifferent. It means you stop fighting the fact that this is what is happening right now. You meet situations as they are, not as problems to be eliminated, but as movements of life asking to be understood. You can recognize this sign in very ordinary moments. A plan falls apart, and instead of immediate frustration, there is a pause. A difficult emotion arises, and instead of suppression, there is space. Someone disappoints you, and instead of collapsing into blame, there is clarity. You still act, you still set boundaries, you still make decisions, but the inner war has ended. Action comes from presence rather than reactivity. Ancient teachings describe this as moving with the grain of reality, not because reality always feels pleasant, but because resistance adds a second layer of suffering that is entirely unnecessary. When resistance dissolves, pain may still arise, but psychological suffering weakens dramatically. This is why awakened individuals often appear unusually steady, not because their lives are easier, but because they are no longer divided against what is. Now here is the practical key, the technique you can apply immediately. It is simple, but not easy. The next time discomfort appears, emotional, physical, or situational, do not ask, "How do I get rid of this?" Ask instead, "Can I allow this moment to exist without commentary?" Not approval, not analysis, allowance. Feel the sensation in the body. Notice where resistance tightens, jaw, shoulders, chest, stomach. Do not try to relax it, simply notice it. Let the sensation exist without adding a story about what it means. And then ask one more question, quietly, inwardly. What is happening right now before I interpret it? This single shift interrupts the habit of resistance. At first, the mind will protest. It will insist that acceptance means weakness, surrender means failure. But if you stay with the raw experience without labeling it, you may notice something remarkable. The intensity softens on its own, not because you controlled it, but because you stopped fighting it. This practice reveals a deeper truth. Life does not need your permission to unfold, but suffering depends entirely on resistance. Anyone can access this wisdom. It does not require belief, discipline, or special knowledge. It only requires honesty, meeting experience before turning it into a problem. And when this second sign stabilizes, when resistance loosens again and again, something even more
Calm, confident, inspiring, mysterious, contemplative. Something even more profound begins to emerge. A shift so subtle that most people never notice it happening. A sign that does not appear in thought, emotion, or behavior, but in who you believe yourself to be. Very few recognize this final threshold when it arrives. If you feel drawn to explore this further, subscribe to the channel and become part of this community. Those quietly learning to read the language beneath appearances. Because the next sign is not something you do, it is something that dissolves the one who has been doing all along. The deepest sign does not appear as an experience. It does not arrive as peace, insight, or even acceptance. It arrives as a quiet collapse of a question you have been asking your entire life, often without realizing it. That question is not, "Who am I becoming?" It is, "Who is the one who has been trying to become anything at all?" This is where awakening reaches its most disarming point. Ancient teachings across cultures hinted at this moment in different ways. Some called it dying before death. Others described it as the tearing of the veil. In the language of early mysticism, it was said that when the eye turns inward far enough, it no longer finds an object, it finds openness. Not emptiness in a cold sense, but a boundless clarity in which everything appears and disappears. Modern language struggles here. Even spiritual language begins to fail. Because the final sign is not something you can observe, it is the recognition that the observer itself is not what you thought it was. Up to this point, awakening may have felt like refinement, less noise, less resistance, more presence, more clarity. But here, something far more radical occurs. The sense of being a separate center, an inner commander watching life from behind the eyes, begins to loosen. Not violently, not dramatically, almost gently. You may notice it in moments when action happens without effort. Words arise without planning. Decisions form without internal debate. Life moves, and there is no sense of someone inside pushing it forward. This can feel unsettling at first, even frightening, because it contradicts everything we were taught about control, identity, and responsibility. Yet beneath that fear is something unmistakable: relief. The realization dawns slowly. The me self you have been protecting, improving, fixing, and defending was never an entity to begin with. It was a pattern, a habit of thought, a story repeated so often it felt solid. And when that story loosens, what remains is not nothing. What remains is presence without ownership. In early Christian mysticism, this was described as kenosis, the emptying of the false self so that something greater could live through the human form. Not a god descending from above, but life recognizing itself from within. The same insight appears in Eastern traditions and even echoes in modern physics, where the observer is no longer separate from the observed, and reality itself is seen as a single, indivisible movement. Here, the awakened life is no longer lived by someone, it is lived as life itself. Emotions still arise, pain still appears, love still flows, but none of it is personal in the way it once was. Suffering no longer defines identity. Joy no longer needs to be possessed. Everything comes and goes within a vast, intimate awareness that does not cling. This is why truly awakened individuals cannot be recognized by behavior alone. From the outside, they may look entirely ordinary, but inwardly, there is no center demanding meaning, no inner voice insisting on control. There is a profound intimacy with existence, an understanding that nothing is outside of what they are. Midway through this reflection, let me say this clearly. This work is not created for profit. It is created out of passion for those who feel this pull, this quiet unraveling, and don't yet have language for it. If this resonates with you, consider subscribing and liking the video. Each small gesture strengthens this community of people willing to look beyond appearances and listen to what moves beneath them. Because when this final sign begins to stabilize, something extraordinary happens. Life stops feeling like a personal journey and starts revealing itself as a shared unfolding. Compassion deepens, not as a moral rule, but as a natural response. When there is no separate self to protect, the boundary between me and you softens, and in that softening, a deeper responsibility emerges. Not obligation, but care. Yet this realization carries a quiet weight, because once the illusion of a separate self loosens, there is no going back to the old way of living. The familiar structures of ambition, fear, and identity begin to lose their authority. And this raises a question that lingers like a low, steady pulse beneath everything else. If there is no separate me directing life, what then is life asking of you now? If you look back now, you may notice that none of these signs were ever meant to turn you into someone extraordinary. They were never invitations to escape the world, to rise above others, or to claim a special spiritual identity. They were invitations of a different kind, quieter, more demanding, and far more intimate. Each sign points in the same direction: the softening of inner noise, the release of resistance, the quiet unraveling of the one who believed it was in control. Together, they form a single movement, a return to what has always been here, patiently waiting beneath effort, fear, and self-definition. Awakening in this sense is not a destination you reach. It is a remembering, a gradual recognition of a deeper intelligence already living your life. This is why these signs often appear during moments of confusion, exhaustion, or loss of certainty. They arrive when the old ways of understanding yourself no longer work, when the mind runs out of answers, when striving becomes too heavy to carry. What feels like disorientation is often the beginning of honesty, and honesty is the doorway. From this place, life begins to change, not because circumstances suddenly improve, but because your relationship to them transforms. You listen more deeply. You respond instead of react. You sense when to move forward and when to wait. You no longer need constant reassurance that you are on the right path, because something deeper than thought is guiding your steps. This does not make life painless, but it makes life real. You start to recognize that awakening is not reserved for mystics, monks, or teachers. It unfolds quietly in ordinary lives, through conversations, through grief, through love, through stillness, through moments of not knowing what comes next. And every person who senses this pull is already part of something larger than they realize. A shared movement, a shared remembering. What you may be feeling is not isolation, it is alignment. Not confusion, but sensitivity. Not loss, but the loosening of what no longer fits.
And when these signs are understood, they no longer feel frightening. They begin to feel purposeful. You are not late. You are not broken. And you are not alone in this. This channel exists to hold space for these recognitions, to speak about what is often felt but rarely named, to remind you that awakening is not about becoming someone else. It is about seeing clearly what you already are and allowing life to move through you with less resistance and more truth. If this journey has resonated with you, take a moment now. Leave a comment with your name and the city you're watching from. It would be an honor to read your words, and some of you will receive a personal greeting in the next video. Your story, your presence matters here. Please also like the video and subscribe to the channel. Each subscription strengthens this community, not as an audience, but as a quiet circle of people listening beneath the surface, choosing awareness over noise. And as you return to your day, carry this question gently with you, not as something to answer, but as something to live into. What if the awakening you have been waiting for has already begun and is now simply asking for your attention?